It was long before his name poisoned the world. At that time, to me, he was just Adolf, a skinny young man hurrying through the streets of Linz in a coat far too worn for how cold it was. If someone had told me what he would become, I would have laughed, or cried, perhaps. But in those days I only saw a strange, intense young man who was hard to understand. I met him on a grey afternoon near the river. The Danube flowed heavy, with that color between green and grey that had always given me a sense of secrecy, as if the water knew more than we did. I had gone out to take a coat to my father, who worked in a workshop, and there he was, sitting on a wooden bench with a notebook on his lap, scribbling something with such fury that the pencil tip looked like it might pierce the paper. He seemed angry at the whole world. The first thing I noticed were his eyes, light-colored but dark inside, as if there was always a storm about to begin. He lifted his face when a stronger gust of wind almost blew his pages away, and I, on instinct, ran to catch one of them before it fell into the water. "Careful," was all he said, reaching out his hand to take the paper back. He didn't say thank you, but he didn't push me away either. We stood there staring at each other for a few uncomfortable seconds. I remember thinking, he looks hungry, but not for food. It was as if he were starving for something invisible. Over time, I realized I wasn't so wrong. In the days that followed, I began seeing him more often in the same area. He was always with that notebook, drawing buildings, windows, columns, staircases, church facades. There was an almost obsessive care in the lines, a desperate urge to prove he was good, that he was talented. One afternoon I gathered my courage. "You draw very well," I ventured, peeking over his shoulder. He started as if he'd been yanked out of a dream, and looked at me with suspicion. "It's still not enough," he muttered. "They didn't understand that at the academy." It was the first time I heard about the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna, and the fact that he had been rejected. It wasn't a simple disappointment. For him it was an open wound, a humiliation that never healed. When he talked about it, his fingers gripped the pencil so tightly, it seemed he wanted to snap it. Mediocre people judging the work of someone with vision. He would say, eyes alight, eyebrows drawn together. People who can't see beyond the obvious. He repeated that so many times that the phrase became a kind of furious refrain. Little by little, I came to know his habits. Adolf was a man of rigid, almost ritualistic routines. He woke up early, even on days when he didn't need to. He said morning was the only time when the world hadn't yet ruined the day. He drank coffee that was too black, too strong, almost always without eating, as if hunger were a nuisance he couldn't waste time feeding. He hardly liked to be touched. When I put my hand on his arm, he would tense up at first, only relaxing a little afterwards. It was as if kindness made him uncomfortable, as if he didn't know where to put his feelings. But sometimes, when he thought I wasn't looking, he would gently adjust the scarf at my neck, or pull out a chair for me to sit. Small, quick things, as if he were afraid of being caught being kind. He was methodical with his things, but careless with his own body. His clothes were wrinkled, his shoes worn out. But the drawings were always stored with extreme care, wrapped in paper, stacked with an order that bordered on excessive. If anyone touched them, he would grow tense, his jaw tight. There was also the way he spoke. When the topic was art, architecture, or music, his voice changed completely. It became vibrant, fast, almost passionate. I remember one night when we went to a concert. He listened to Wagner as if he were witnessing a revelation. Eyes closed, body still, only his fingers twitching in time with the music. At the end, he left the hall with a kind of exaltation that scared me a little. "This is it," he said, gesturing in the air. "This is how a people should feel. Uplifted, strong, united." It was one of the first times I heard the word people from his mouth with that strange weight. It wasn't people the way I understood it. Neighbors, friends, families. To him, it seemed like a bigger, almost abstract concept, but loaded with emotion. At first, I thought it was just the idealism of a young man angry at his own life, but there was something in the intensity with which he spoke, in the almost feverish gleam in his eyes that left me uneasy. Another thing impossible to ignore was his tendency to always blame someone. There was always a they who controlled art, they who kept talent from rising, they who ruined the city, the culture, the future. I didn't understand much, I was young, but I could already sense the bitterness accumulating behind that vague word. Sometimes he was more direct, letting slip harsh comments, full of contempt. Whenever that happened, my stomach tightened as if I had heard something that shouldn't exist. But then, at other times, he seemed almost fragile. In his rented room, far too cramped for so much paper, he would sit on the windowsill and stare at the empty street while the cold crept in through the cracks. "Do you think I'll make it?" he asked once without looking at me. I knew he wasn't just talking about going back to the academy. It was more than that. He wanted to be someone, to be seen, respected, perhaps feared. There was an ambition there that didn't match the size of the room or his worn-out shoes. "I think you're too stubborn to give up," I replied, trying to smile. He gave a half-smile, that short, almost dry laugh that sometimes seemed more like a spasm than joy. Back then I wouldn't have called him evil. I would have called him wounded. A young man carrying more resentment than any heart that young should have to bear. Someone who had turned every closed door into fuel for a dangerous flame that I didn't yet know how to name. If I close my eyes today, so many years later, I can still see him sitting at the table, hunched over the paper, the oil lamp casting harsh shadows on his face. His hand moving quickly, tracing lines of grand buildings, huge squares, avenues far too wide for the small town we lived in. He wasn't just drawing facades, he was drawing a world that matched the size of his ambition. Back then, I only thought I was close to a misunderstood artist. I had no idea I was sitting beside an abyss. I used to tell myself that no one is born dangerous, that wickedness, when it exists, arrives slowly, like a crack in the wall that we only notice when it's already running all the way through. With Adolf, that crack began to show in the conversations we had at dusk, when the city grew quieter, and he allowed himself to say what he really thought, without filtering his words. Linz was too small for his ambitions. He said this with a mix of disdain and melancholy. We walked through the quiet streets, past bakeries that closed early, workshops smelling of oil and wood, lit windows where families ate dinner unhurriedly. A kind of normality that never seemed to belong to him. "The people here don't understand anything," he would grumble. "They live such small lives. How can they be satisfied with that?" I looked at the lined-up houses, at the mothers calling their children inside, and I wondered why that bothered him so much. To me, that simple life was what made the world bearable. But to him, it was like a constant reminder that he was trapped. One winter afternoon, we ran into my younger brother on the street. He was carrying firewood, his face red from the cold. When I introduced him to Adolf, Adolf greeted him with a brief, impatient nod, like someone who is wasting time. My brother left and I joked. "He got nervous. You have that effect on people." He didn't smile. He kept staring in the direction the boy had gone and said, "He's lucky he already knows his place in the world." I wanted to ask what that meant, but his gaze was far away, fixed on something I couldn't see. It was like that often. We'd be having a normal conversation, and suddenly he would dive into thoughts he didn't share with me. Even so, there were moments of unexpected kindness. I remember a day when I arrived at the boarding house where he lived. It was raining, my shoes soaked, the hem of my skirt muddy. He opened the door and, seeing me shivering, put a coat over my shoulders without saying a word. That simple gesture made my heart race. For a moment he seemed like just a young man trying to take care of someone. But gestures like that were always cut short by something harder, colder. One night he showed me a drawing he had made of a huge square with colossal buildings, rigid lines, a layout that looked more like a manifesto than a work of art. "This is how a city should be," he said, excited. "Strong, grand. None of these flimsy little houses that look like they'll collapse with a gust of wind." "But the people," I began. "People adapt," he cut in, dryly. "They need to be taught greatness." It was strange to hear that word coming from someone who lived in a tiny room, struggled to pay rent, and ate little so he could save a few coins for coal in the winter. Maybe precisely because of that he spoke so much about greatness. Maybe it was his way of escaping his own reality. I could see that he was exhausted. Sometimes his hands trembled from cold and hunger. He spent hours drawing without rest, as if he were afraid that if he stopped, everything would collapse. And when he went back to talking about the academy, the resentment resurfaced. "They don't know anything about true art," he repeated. "They're afraid of anyone who thinks big." I tried to console him, saying he could try again, that maybe a new opportunity would come. He looked at me as if I were too naive to understand the scale of the injustice he believed he was living. He also had strange habits. He almost never laughed. When he did, it was sudden, brief, as if he were laughing at something secret. He didn't like crowds, but he also didn't like being completely alone. It was as if he were haunted by his own silence. What bothered him most, though, was criticism. Any comment about his drawings, even something minimal, made him tense, jaw clenched. "They don't understand," he would say. "No one understands." Sometimes I wanted to tell him that the world doesn't owe anyone anything, that we all carry disappointments, losses, dreams that never come true. But when I met his eyes, that anxious, wounded shine, I lost my courage. He always seemed on the verge of something, of an outburst, a dream, an ambition too big for the thin body that carried it. Even so, I still saw in him a young man trying to find himself. I remember a calm afternoon, sitting by the river. The winter sun was low, tinting everything in a pale gold. He stayed quiet for a long time, just watching the water. "Sometimes I think things could have been different," he murmured. "If they had given me a chance." There was a vulnerability there that moved me deeply. For a few seconds he seemed like just a boy who wanted to be accepted, who longed for a place in the world. "It still can be," I ventured. "You're still young?" He turned his face toward me with a look that mixed hope with something darker. "The world is going to have to listen to me one day," he said, almost like a silent vow. A faint shiver ran down my spine, though I couldn't have said why. Maybe because for the first time I felt he wasn't talking about art. Not exactly. After that, he changed a little. He began to walk faster, speak with more conviction, as if following an invisible path. The days when he seemed fragile became rarer. The exalted ones, more frequent. I felt I was losing him little by little, although I had never really had him completely. In a way, maybe that was the first fracture. Small, almost imperceptible, but announcing that something bigger would one day break. Vienna was unlike anything I had ever known. When Adolf decided to try his luck there again, at first I thought it was just another impulse, the kind he had when he felt especially defeated or especially grand. But no, he was determined. And as always, when an idea fixed itself in his mind, nothing in the world could change it. I remember the day he left. The train station was full of smoke, the metallic clatter of the cars echoing like heavy breathing. He clutched the folder with his drawings to his chest so tightly that his fingers turned white. He looked at me for only a moment before boarding, and in that look, there was something that mixed promise and farewell. "In Vienna, everything begins," he said. It wasn't a romantic or dramatic goodbye. It was just a short sentence, but inside it was an ambition I still didn't know how to read. We spent months writing letters to each other. The first ones were lively, written in haste, telling of the wide streets, the palaces he studied devoutly, the people who walked past him without realizing that, in his mind, he was already redesigning the entire city. He talked about cafes where he spent hours watching strangers, about the buildings he thought were beautiful, and those that, according to him, should be torn down to make way for more worthy constructions. But little by little, the tone of the letters began to change. The second attempt at the academy didn't work. That rejection, that second closed door, fell on him like a blow I couldn't measure from afar. The Viennese newspapers never mentioned it, of course, but from his words I understood that failure consumed him like a fever. They turned me down again. They remain aware only of what is small. They can't recognize greatness. That "they" I already knew began to appear again, more and more often, and always charged with resentment. When winter came, his letters grew scarcer, the words shorter, the silences longer. I wrote several times asking where he was living, whether he'd found work, whether he was eating properly. He rarely answered anything concrete, only vague sentences like, "I don't need much. Others settle. I don't. There are hard days, but it is necessary to go through them." Then, suddenly, a longer letter, different. In it he wrote that he was selling small hand-painted postcards to survive. He painted scenes of Vienna, buildings, squares, architectural details. The city was his only source of income, and as always, he analyzed it with a gaze far too severe for a young man sleeping in cheap shelters and fighting the cold. But there was something else that worried me more than the poverty, the way he described people. There are groups that control everything here, people who decide what has value and what doesn't, people who corrode the culture of the people. When I read that, I felt the same knot in my stomach I had felt months earlier, when he spoke of greatness and his contempt for small lives. Something was forming inside him, or something growing like a shadow, fed by frustration and wounded pride. Even so, I decided to visit him. I traveled with my father under the pretext of buying supplies for the workshop, but in truth I just wanted to see with my own eyes whether he was all right. Vienna greeted us with its usual grandeur, carriages crossing wide avenues, cafes smelling of fresh bread, buildings that seemed designed to impress and intimidate at the same time. I found Adolf in a small boarding house near Leopoldstadt. He was thinner than I remembered, his face more strained, his eyes even more restless. But when he saw me at the door, he gave a smile that almost made me believe he was the same young man from Linz. "You came," he said, and there was a hint of surprise and gratitude in his voice. We spent the afternoon walking around the city. He showed me the buildings he admired, the details he said no one else noticed. He talked without stopping, about art, about politics, about injustices, about what he called cultural degeneration. I tried to listen, tried to understand, but there was a new hardness in his words, a tone that hadn't existed before. And yet, there were also moments when I recognized him. On the bridge over the river, he pointed to a building he had redrawn several times, and his eyes shone as they once had. "I could transform this city," he said. "Make everything more coherent, stronger. You can still be an artist," I replied, trying to pull him back towards something that wouldn't hurt the world. He shook his head. "The world doesn't need artists. It needs vision." I fell silent. I didn't know how to argue with someone who saw the world as if it belonged to him, as if it were just waiting to recognize his place in it. When night fell, he insisted on walking me back to the inn where I was staying with my father. Before saying goodbye, he gripped my hands tightly. A rare gesture from him. "Don't forget," he said quietly. "One day, all of this will make sense." I wanted to ask what exactly would make sense. But the truth is, I was afraid of the answer. After that visit, our letters were never the same. He wrote less about art and more about ideas. Ideas too big, too rigid. It seemed as if Vienna had lit a flame inside him that burned fast and hot, fed by cold nights, successive failures, and the people he blamed for everything. I felt that some part of him was changing, a vital part, and that perhaps it was too late to stop it. Sometimes I still remember how his voice echoed through the city's broad streets, mixing dreams and bitterness, as if Vienna had planted in him something that would later become a storm. When I think of that time, it feels as if I'm watching my own life through a fogged-up window. I was still too young to fully understand what was happening before my eyes, but old enough to feel that something was slipping from my grasp. Like fine sand running through my fingers, Adolf's letters became fewer and fewer. Sometimes months went by without a single word. Other times, short notes would arrive, scribbled in haste, with a mix of restless excitement and growing bitterness. He wrote about meetings he attended, about men who shared his resentment, about long speeches. Some he listened to. Others he was beginning to rehearse himself. I've found people who finally understand what I've been saying. Now I see that my failure at the academy was no accident. There are forces working against us. But not forever. His handwriting changed too. From careful lines to quick, irregular, almost anxious strokes. Sometimes I wondered if it was the same hand that drew cathedrals with such patience. My family gradually noticed my unease. My father said to me once as he sanded a piece of wood in the workshop, "Daughter, some people carry clouds inside them. When the rain comes, it sometimes washes away everything around them." He didn't mention Adolf, but he didn't have to. I just nodded, a lump in my throat. As the years passed, the distance between us ceased to be merely geographical. It became a distance of ideas, of paths, of some sort of shadow growing between us that I no longer knew how to cross. Even so, I was never able to forget him. The last time I saw him before the war began was in Vienna, on a cold, almost silent morning. He had written to me, inviting me to visit. There was something different in that letter, an almost urgent tone. I decided to go. When I arrived, I found a man transformed, not physically. He was still thin, pale, with that same look intoxicated by ideas. But there was something new in his bearing, something that mixed conviction with impatience, as if he were about to push past any limit. "You came," he said, and for an instant I saw the young man I had met by the Danube. But the softer expression vanished as quickly as it appeared. "Walk with me." He led me through streets I already knew, but that felt different beside him. As we walked, he pointed out buildings, talked about politics, injustices, about what needed to change. His words came fast, sharp, as if he had waited years to release them. I listened in silence. Part of me still wanted to see him as the sensitive boy who drew facades with hands trembling from the cold. Another part was beginning to recognize that there was something in him I could no longer follow. In a square, he stopped and looked around, as if checking whether anyone was watching us. "I wasn't made to live small," he said, his voice low, almost rough. "When I look at all this, I feel like I can reshape the world. Don't you see?" I didn't know what to say. I saw the square, the people, the buildings. He saw something I couldn't reach. "The world is wrong, and I can fix it," he went on, each word more intense than the last. People need direction, strength, someone to show them the right path. I felt a shiver crawl up the back of my neck. It wasn't fear of him, not yet, but fear of what I sensed emerging in his convictions. Adolf, I began, placing my hand lightly on his arm. He drew back a little, not in aggression, but from some sort of instinct, as if the touch broke the rhythm of whatever he was building inside himself. "Don't try to stop me," he murmured. "You don't understand. Not yet." I smiled sadly. I understood more than he thought. I understood that I had lost him. After that meeting, our lives took opposite paths. The war arrived like a wave that swallowed everything, including the peaceful memory of our youth. Adolf enlisted. I stayed in Linz, working, helping my mother, trying to keep the family together while the world tore itself apart around us. News was slow to reach us, but when it did, it always carried the same kind of comment. He was wounded. He received a medal. He stood out among the others. And later, comments about fiery speeches, about followers, about ideas spreading like wildfire through dry straw. I never took part in that storm, but I felt it cut across my life like a sharp wind. In the streets, in whispers, in wary looks, in the growing feeling that an entire world was changing shape around us, and not for the better. My family eventually split apart. Some left for faraway places, seeking safety in countries still outside the darkness. Others stayed, trying to survive as best they could. And I learned to carry a kind of silence that only those who live through turbulent times truly know. One morning, many years later, when the conflict had already engulfed almost all of Europe, I heard his name on the radio, not as the boy who drew buildings, nor as the skinny young man who walked with me through the streets of Linz, but as the figure the whole world would come to know. A figure who bore unbearably heavy decisions, irreparable consequences, and who no longer had anything to do with the young man with a notebook in his hands. I turned off the radio slowly. I stayed at the window for a long time, until the glass fogged up with my breath. I thought of that wooden bench by the river, of the sheet of paper that almost flew into the water, of the first time I held his drawings for him. I thought of the light in his eyes that sometimes seemed like hope, sometimes like a storm. I thought of the cracks I had ignored, believing that a little affection might mend them. I didn't know, in that naive youth, that some storms begin small, inside a wounded heart, and grow until they reach the entire world. Today, looking back, I know that the young man I knew exists only in memory. What he became belongs to history, a heavy, sad history that still echoes. As for me, all that remains is the memory of what existed before the shadow grew too large to be contained.